Today you have a phenomenon called the New Right, who believe that in fact conservatives in general should not be opposed to stronger government as long as it is put to conservative uses. You're going to use centralized power to accomplish your ends, but what does that do to civil society? Does it mean that civil society, in fact, is atrophied and is not able to exercise itself and exercise its own authority because instead everything is concentrated centrally and the big government is basically crowding out the social function of the family and the church and civil society? If conservatives are in favor of smaller government, just how small can the government be? Very few conservatives would call themselves anarchists, but some of our libertarian friends actually do so. There are, among libertarians, some very radical believers in the smallest possible government, which is no government at all. And they call themselves anarcho-capitalists. One of their great theorists of the 20th century was a man by the name of Murray Rothbard. And Rothbard is interesting because although he was a very hardcore libertarian and in fact a self-described anarchist or anarcho-capitalist, he was also someone who is quite personally conservative and who was in fact in the late 1990s a supporter of Pat Buchanan, who might seem to be the farthest possible thing from either a libertarian or certainly an anarchist. But you have very interesting developments on the American right in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which is, of course, the same time that you have globalization taking place in America and around the planet. It is an era in American politics and indeed in world history when the idea of national sovereignty is under assault, when you have, the rise of a belief in open borders, you have, the United States going abroad in search of monsters to destroy in Iraq and all around the planet. This is what's happening in the late 1990s. And even though in some cases you will find libertarians who wanted to defend these things that were happening in the late 90s, there was also a serious criticism being mounted by people like Murray Rothbard and Ron Paul, who was a very close friend and ally of Dr. Rothbard's. The two of them both saw certainly the foreign policy element here as being something that was very bad in the late 1990s, the idea that we would have perpetual wars or forever wars trying to export democracy and liberalism to Iraq and to other parts of the planet. But they also had some criticisms of even the idea of open borders. Many libertarians were in favor of open borders. They thought that the free movement of people across borders was a natural demand of liberty. But Rothbard and some of his allies actually argued that, in fact, this would be very destructive of the unique civilization that the United States had, and that, in fact, as long as you had a vast federal leviathan, this government that provides entitlements and welfare benefits and so many other things, for the sake of poorer Americans, that if you opened this kind of welfare state up to new immigrants from around the world, the result would be a total imbalance. You would basically be importing a new set of clients by the millions for the welfare state and for the federal government. So in fact, even someone like Murray Rothbard, who was a libertarian and indeed an anarcho-capitalist, was very critical of this idea of open borders, just as he was critical of America's foreign policy that involved nation building and democracy exportation around the world. So there were very interesting things happening a quarter century ago on the American right, including even among libertarians. And not all the libertarians were defenders of this new age of globalization. Some of them were very stark critics of it. Rothbard, by the way, even had some interesting views on free trade. As a libertarian economist, he was in fact quite supportive of free trade in principle, but he was very much critical of agreements like NAFTA, for example, and of organizations like the World Trade Organization, because Rothbard said these agreements and organizations were not actually promoting free trade. What they were promoting instead was managed trade and the harmonization of government regulation across borders, in effect a kind of world government. So Rothbard, as a hardline, absolutist free trader, thought that actually most free trade agreements were bad because they involved regulations, and because, according to Rothbard, the best kind of free trade might even be unilateral free trade. It doesn't matter if other countries are imposing trade restrictions upon you, if they have support for their own industries, if they have currency manipulations. Rothbard wasn't worried about any of that. He thought that ultimately the logic of the market could not be defeated, and therefore a country that was practicing free trade would prosper, and those that tried not to practice it would wind up, in the long run, facing disaster. Now, as I said, Rothbard was actually allied with Pat Buchanan, and Rothbard was very critical of a group of people on the center-right in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s who were known as the neoconservatives. And these neoconservatives were also the enemies of Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan's conservative cadres and intellectuals around him were known as the paleoconservatives. Paleo being the Greek root that means old, neo, of course, being the Greek root that means new. The paleoconservatives thought of themselves as representing an older style of American conservatism dating back certainly to the early post-World War II era of figures like Richard Weaver, Robert Nisbet, and Russell Kirk. But the paleoconservatives also thought of themselves as having roots going back further as well, whereas the neoconservatives tended to think of themselves as people who had made a migration from the political left to the political right. They often had a background in social democratic politics, even in some cases, infamously in the case of Irving Kristol, who was the godfather of neoconservatism. Kristol had been a Trotskyist in his youth. And so the neoconservatives have a odyssey, a journey basically from the left to something that they thought of as being the right. But they never actually went all the way and became the same kind of conservatives as the paleoconservatives, the Buchananites, or indeed older figures like Barry Goldwater and his political supporters. The neoconservatives always thought there was a big problem with the older American right in the 1980s and 1990s and earlier. The neoconservatives basically thought people like Barry Goldwater and certainly hardline libertarians like Murray Rothbard, neoconservatives thought that they were simply unrealistic and unworldly, insufficiently political. Neoconservatives believed the welfare state was here to stay, and therefore the best you could do was have a somewhat more conservative, welfare state, one that would be promoting something like Victorian values rather than eroding them. The neoconservatives also tended to become very hawkish in foreign policy. This was true during the Cold War, but it becomes even more so after the end of the Cold War, when the neoconservatives become the primary supporters on the center-right of this idea that America has a mission to police the world and promote liberalism and democracy all around the planet. Neoconservatives didn't necessarily have a full-throated support for free trade, but on the whole, they were relatively sympathetic to it. Similarly, when it comes to immigration, neoconservatives were actually very much in favor of immigration on a large scale in principle. And neoconservatives were very aggressive, actually, at labeling Pat Buchanan and anyone who was critical of immigration and who was on the political right. The neoconservatives would label them as nativists or xenophobes. Generally, the neoconservatives would use the same language that the left had used against all conservatives. The neoconservatives would use that language against paleoconservatives and Buchananites. The theme I want to get onto, however, is this relationship between a very strong traditionalist conservatism that you see represented by Pat Buchanan and the paleoconservatives on the one hand, and this very surprising anarchist element, which you find among libertarians like Murray Rothbard. How can those things possibly gel together? Did they work even back in the 1990s? Do they have any relationship now in the 21st century? Of course, today you have a phenomenon called the New Right, and many young conservatives who believe that, in fact, conservatives in general should not be opposed to stronger government, that conservatives perhaps ought to be in favor of stronger government as long as it is put to conservative uses, and that, in fact, there is a place for a large and a strong government in trying to restore virtue in America and in trying to promote Christianity, trying to promote all kinds of traditional commitments that conservatives have held dear, and that trying to shrink the government down to nothing, in their view, is actually much more of a left-wing view than it is a right-wing view. So you have these different elements which are both in tension but also surprisingly sometimes wind up being allied to one another. And it may seem as if in some respects the new right of the 21st century is recapitulating some of the ideas of the neoconservatives. Certainly the notion that you could have a conservative welfare state, again, was something that was identified more with the neoconservatives than with Pat Buchanan or the paleoconservatives or Murray Rothbard and the Libertarians. Although I should say there are exceptions to many of these rules. So a paleoconservative conservative thinker, an expert on family policy by the name of Alan Carlson, who's a very important figure and well worth tracking down his books and reading. Alan Carlson was, in fact, a paleoconservative who made the case that the New Deal actually had a socially conservative component, and that before feminists took over the welfare state was actually in favor of working wages for American men. It was actually, promoting, a division of labor between men in the workforce and women who would be looking after children, and that the New Deal actually, tried to assist in this. Carlson is very unusual. Alan Carlson is unusual in having those views. Most other paleoconservatives saw the welfare state as, in fact, being something that was parasitical upon and destructive to the American family and to America's communities in general, including its religious communities. The connection between the paleoconservatives and anarcho-capitalist libertarians like Murray Rothbard can be found in the fact that they both had a rejection of the way in which American government had come about since the New Deal and the kinds of powers that it wielded in the late 20th century and into the beginning of the 21st century. That basically, even though the paleoconservatives were not anarchists or libertarians, they did see that what we would now call wokeness was in fact something that was being promoted very heavily by the United States federal government, and that the federal government was often directly destructive of local communities. It was certainly destructive of, the kinds of authority that states and localities had previously wielded. The federal government, usually in the name of some noble cause like civil rights, would come in and would actually transform things and start using centralized power to promote not just civil rights for African Americans, but in fact promoting an entire panoply of left-wing causes, including feminism, including gay rights, including all kinds of things which back in the 20th century were in fact radical innovations and a revolutionary change in American society. So even though paleoconservatives and other conservatives were not necessarily libertarians, they were certainly not anarchists or anarcho-capitalists, nevertheless they agreed with many of their libertarian friends, and even a quite radical anarcho-capitalist like Murray Rothbard, in this idea that the federal government really was the enemy. It was the enemy that was in fact promoting a lot of the social radicalism that the left was enthusiastic about. And of course, it was no coincidence, they thought, that Democrats and liberals and progressives and the far left, they all constantly wanted to have more and more power put into the federal government. They wanted to use the federal government to reconstruct the family. They wanted to use the federal government as a cudgel against religion. They wanted to use the federal government as a cudgel against local government. In all these ways, it seemed as if there was a comprehensive program on the American left for concentrating power in the federal government, using that as their primary instrument to kind of level society, attack everything traditional, and reconstruct society in a new left-wing cultural framework. By the way, the best book on this topic actually was written much later. So in 2020, the journalist Christopher Caldwell wrote a book called The Age of Entitlement. And that book really does kind of spell out the case for how the federal government is responsible for much of the social revolution that has taken place in America in the last 50 years or more. Even though that book was written in 2020, many of the views that it lays out were things that paleoconservatives and indeed libertarians like Murray Rothbard were already talking about in the late 1980s and in the 1990s and early 2000s. So these ideas have been, sort of bubbling up on the American right for quite a long time. And it's only quite recently in 2020 that they found this great expression in Christopher Caldwell's book, The Age of Entitlement. Now, while I have described what might sound like an alliance of convenience between paleoconservatives and Murray Rothbard-style anarcho-capitalist libertarians starting in the 1990s, by the way, those libertarians started to adopt a new term for themselves in contrast to the libertarians who were in favor of left-wing social causes, libertarians who were in favor of globalization, even if that meant what someone like Murray Rothbard called managed trade with NAFTA and these other agreements. The libertarians who were opposed to all that started referring to themselves in some cases as paleo-libertarians, using the same prefix as the paleoconservatives to denote that there is a certain amount of sympathy there. The paleoconservatives themselves, by the way, were a fairly broad church, and among the paleoconservatives, you can detect distinct Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian elements. The Hamiltonian elements included someone like Pat Buchanan, who was very much a supporter of industrial policy, a supporter of tariffs. Also, you had a theorist such as Sam Francis, who is a writer for the Washington Times and for Chronicles magazine. And Francis was seen in some ways as being, Pat Buchanan's consigliere, or his great sort of intellectual, master planner. Sam Francis was also very much on the Hamiltonian side of paleoconservatism in favor of industrial policy. Sam Francis thought that states' rights and the romance of, the Old South, he thought all of that was very literary and not very practical or political. So Sam Francis was actually a nationalist and not someone who believed in a lot of regionalism. Francis, and to some degree Buchanan, both also did see, in fact, a role for the federal government in doing certain things, so they were not simply decentralists and anti-government people. On the other hand, they weren't simply in favor of big government for the sake of big government or trying to have the federal government micromanage everything in the country. They did see the American left as having control over much of the federal government, especially its social policies. So the Hamiltonians actually had a very mixed view as to whether or not you should have smaller government or government that was still quite large but that in fact was on the conservative side of things. You also had a Jeffersonian element in paleoconservatism, and this was represented by someone like Clyde Wilson. Clyde Wilson was a Southerner. He's still alive today. He is a great scholar of John C. Calhoun, the 19th century champion of concurrent majoritarianism and critic of the Tariff of Abominations. Calhoun is a very interesting political figure who, of course, is seen as being a very demonic figure because of his support of slavery and other things. But Clyde Wilson was a scholar who had edited the Calhoun papers and who represented this more Jeffersonian side of paleoconservatism, which said, in fact, the federal government was kind of the opponent of conservatism all the way down the line. So with those divisions within paleoconservatism itself, you can see that there was a possibility for complex interactions with libertarians like Murray Rothbard and Ron Paul. That, in many cases, the Jeffersonian side of the paleo-libertarians was very close indeed to someone like Ron Paul or Rothbard. And in fact, the Jeffersonian side of the paleo-libertarians tended to be in favor of free trade. Clyde Wilson was actually very interested in the economics of Ludwig von Mises. So there was a bridge connecting paleoconservatism and paleolibertarianism, even within paleoconservatism itself, even in figures like Clyde Wilson. And there were a number of others, too, who had that view. Now, this era is very interesting to me because I was in college and in graduate school at this time, and I was just learning about conservatism. In high school, I had read National Review. I'd listened somewhat to Rush Limbaugh. I'd listened to G. Gordon Liddy, who was a much more exciting radio host than Rush Limbaugh was even. And I started reading some of the magazines of the American right, including the American Spectator, including the occasional copy of the Weekly Standard or Commentary. Both of those were seen as being neoconservative magazines. And I started reading very frequently, and in fact regularly, and subscribing to the primary paleoconservative journal, which was Chronicles magazine. And I also was reading, of course, Modern Age, which is the host of this podcast, and of which I am the editor today. And Modern Age was always more aligned with the traditionalist and paleoconservative side of things. Modern Age also had always been a venue that provided an interesting forum for some of these debates on the right. So you'll find in the archives of Modern Age, which are online at modernagejournal.com, for example, articles by someone like Murray Rothbard entering into debate with some of these great conservatives of the 20th century like Russell Kirk and Robert Nisbet and a whole host of others. So these questions about the relationship between small government, libertarianism, and even anarchism and conservatism were something that Modern Age had devoted decades, in fact, of publishing to exploring. And in the 1990s and early 2000s, as I say, Chronicles magazine was really bearing the standards for paleoconservatism. It was the primary conservative intellectual journal up until the founding of the American Conservative magazine, but that's a story for another time and is rather complicated. Like I say, all this story was very interesting to me because as I was first learning about conservatism, this was the milieu in which it was taking place. Just as a lot of young conservatives today are learning about what it means to be conservative in the context of the new right, in the context of this debate between freedom conservatives and integralists or Christian nationalists. These debates that are happening on the American right today and that are very lively, they were very similar to debates that were taking place in the 1990s and early 2000s between the paleocons, libertarians, neocons, and others. And in fact, there's a relationship between today's debates and yesterday's debates. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, and if you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends. Share the link on social media, on Facebook, on X, on LinkedIn, wherever you have an audience. You'll find that if they are people who are interested in intelligent conservative thought, they might enjoy this podcast. You can also read Modern Age in print. We have a quarterly journal that, of course, comes out every 3 months. It has a wonderful history going back all the way to 1957 when it was founded by Russell Kirk and Henry Regnery. And today you can also find Modern Age on the web at www.modernagejournal.com. Again, that's www.modernagejournal.com. And there every weekday you will find a new article either pulled from our great archives or from the most recent issue of the print magazine, or indeed an originally commissioned article for the internet from some of the brightest lights, not only of conservative thought going back, more than 60 years, but also the greatest conservative thinkers on the American right of today. But in the course of looking at these debates on the American right in the 1990s and early 2000s, I came to see that I agreed very much with the paleo side of things, with the paleoconservatives and the paleo-libertarians. And I thought the paleo-libertarians actually had one thing in their favor that the paleoconservatives didn't. Namely, the paleoconservatives, especially the more Hamiltonian among them, wanted to have a very complicated relationship with the federal government because, again, they saw it as having many beneficial potentials for a sort of national conservatism, but the paleoconservatives also saw that wokeness, or political correctness as it was known at the time, was something that the federal government was very heavily involved in promoting. Whereas the paleo-libertarians and the Jeffersonian side of the paleoconservative movement both had a thoroughgoing critique and rejection not only of the federal government, they were consistent on that point, but also they were very critical of modern statism in all its forms, abroad as well as, in not just the federal government, but also state governments and localities. And there was something very exciting and sort of radical and pure and direct about some of these very thoroughgoing critiques of the modern state that were coming from libertarians like Murray Rothbard. And in fact, I started reading Rothbard. I thought he was a very interesting and exciting thinker. And yet, for Rothbard, as an anarcho-capitalist and as a libertarian, he truly believed that the free market could solve almost all our problems, including social problems, including the problems of, the culture in America, that if only we got rid of the federal government, got rid of government at almost every level, and had everything on a private property basis, that would in fact be ideal and would create a socially conservative environment as well as creating a maximally capitalist environment. So Rothbard, especially by the end of his life, he dies in 1995, Rothbard sees a combination, he basically sees libertarian means, absolute, anarcho-capitalism, as serving conservative ends and creating a more socially conservative America. Now, he believed that in part because so much of what exists in terms of leftism in America is either directly subsidized or indirectly subsidized by the federal government. So it is a creation in some ways of government and might not exist without it. But also there is a sense in which the almost Darwinian aspect of anarcho-capitalism, this law of the jungle and survival of the fittest, would actually play to the advantage of conservatism if indeed conservative social order, a conservative social order based in the family and in churches and in civil society, if that in fact is stronger when you don't have the federal government subsidizing leftist failure, if you don't have that, if people have to make do on their own, either in free enterprise or through their social communities, then in fact those traditional communities are going to be the strongest institutions in society. They will be be the ones that actually proliferate and triumph in this, sort of Darwinian environment of, no government and just capitalism. And so I became interested in this question. Could you have a kind of conservative anarchism in philosophy, not in policy, but in principle, in the realm of ideas, that was somewhat divorced from or distant from this, capitalist ideal that Murray Rothbard wanted to promote? Because, I, as a conservative, was somewhat skeptical of capitalism. Capitalism is very good. It produces tremendous amounts of material prosperity. It can also have some advantageous effects on personal character. It does encourage industriousness. It encourages honesty in dealing with other people. It encourages, a great many virtues that are identified with the bourgeoisie as a class. But capitalism also diminishes other virtues, and it tends to put things on a utilitarian footing. It tends to say that, by implication, that trying to gain wealth and succeed in business is more important than other things, whereas in fact, a conservative will tend to say, actually, it is community, family, church, things like that are more important than one's success in the marketplace. It's not that libertarians explicitly argue for the greater importance of the marketplace, but there is an implication in the amount of study and research and promotion and the rhetoric that is employed by libertarians in talking about the market relative to their discussion of voluntary civil society in the form of religion, the family, and other community institutions. They really put most of their emphasis on markets and business and the profit motive rather than talking about this other side to life, which is, our lives together as, friends and families and neighbors. So I started looking at the conservative tradition, and I noticed that, in fact, there were a number of conservatives who entered into a very interesting discussion with certain varieties of anarchism. This was true, for example, of Robert Nisbet. Robert Nisbet is one of the great traditionalist conservative thinkers of the post-World War II era. He writes a book in 1953 called The Quest for Community. He writes a later book called The Twilight of Authority, which is very influential on me. He is a sociologist by training, and he's teaching at Berkeley and other high-profile colleges and universities. But Nisbet is a very solid conservative. He's a Burkean conservative. He also takes a great many ideas from Alexis de Tocqueville. And Nisbet's view is that, in fact, there are sort of three major institutional forces, or forces, social forces, one might say, in the modern world. There is the state, that is government at all levels. There is community, which includes these traditional, very conservative institutions like the church and the family and the neighborhood. And then there is the market. And Nisbet argued that the market is really the thing that libertarians promote and discuss to the maximum degree possible. The state tends to be the thing that progressives and liberals actually focus on. They want to increase state power, government power, especially the power of the federal government. And conservatives, according to Nisbet, and he traces this idea to Edmund Burke, Nisbet argues that conservatives actually focus on this third element, which is neither the state nor the market, which is in fact community, family, religion, and all of the things that we enjoy as neighbors and as people who are part of a culture and a civilization, but that are not simply directed by either bureaucratic government, nor are they driven by the profit motive and by the structure of the market. And Nisbet saw that this third element in society is very much besieged both by the federal government and by state power and its leftist tendencies, but also by the market and capitalism. That in fact capitalism and the market often are solvents of the network of human connections that can constitute a flourishing civil society and community. This, by the way, is a view you can also find echoed to some degree, even in some of today's 21st century writers. So Patrick Deneen, who is seen as being one of the leading lights of what is now called post-liberalism, if you take a close look at Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed, you'll see that Deneen actually alludes to this Nisbetian idea. So even though Deneen is often portrayed and to some degree actually is in favor of a more conservative takeover of government at every level and is not as allergic allergic to big government as someone like Robert Nisbet was. Nevertheless, Deneen does point out in Why Liberalism Failed that in fact liberalism and leftism uses both market mechanisms and also big government in order to promote a kind of comprehensive left-wing transformation of American culture. And that in fact, in many respects, the market itself has been co-opted by and has been sort of re-engineered by the rules that are put in place by the federal government. Now, that latter point is something that's only somewhat implicit in Deneen's own work, but certainly is made very explicit in earlier conservative thinkers and writers like Robert Nisbet. And it's something that also, you can find it in Christopher Caldwell in the 21st century. You can find it among paleoconservatives and libertarians talking about the sort of corruption that takes place as the free market and the federal government sort of interact with one another. That's something that conservatives were very concerned about going back all the way to World War II, and in fact even beyond that. Nisbet actually argued that in some respects, certain forms of anarchism that were not simply left-wing, vandalism and destruction, but rather the more philosophical modes of anarchism had something in common with conservatives in that they tended to emphasize the importance of this third element, this community element, a civil society, voluntary society, that was neither the coercive power of government, nor was it simply the market-driven profit motives of capitalism. So to the extent that, anarchists like Kropotkin, for example, who was a Russian thinker of the 19th century, or any, Bakunin and others to some degree as well, to the extent that they emphasized this idea of a voluntary society as against either a coercive state power or the motives of the market, which often, again, the anarchists of the 19th century were quite clear that very often, supposedly, the supposedly free market was actually supported by and sort of backed up by the coercive power of the state, and that in fact those two things had a very close relationship. And obviously, the rich often had a great deal of power over governments in the 19th century. Anarchists would make those points, and they would say that they wanted to support a kind of civil society that was voluntary as the thing that they saw as being an alternative either to the market or to the state, or indeed to this sort of unholy combination of the market and the state together. And conservatives similarly would emphasize, without being anarchists, conservatives would emphasize that they too were in favor of the traditional social order. Now, I want to make clear here, some of these 19th century anarchists really were thoroughgoing leftists, and they were anti-institutional across the board. So they not only were opposed to government and, big government in particular, they were not only opposed to the market and corporations and capitalism. These left-wing anarchists in the 19th century were often against all institutions, including the institution of marriage, including the family. They really wanted to basically abolish everything. And then you would have just a miraculous new, progressive social order of peace and harmony arise out of the wreckage of all institutions. And you can even find, some implications to that, to that end in someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century. Rousseau was not an anarchist, but there were anarchists who took inspiration from this Rousseauistic vision of a kind of peaceful and harmonious state of nature without any institutions. And this Rousseauian idea that it's institutions which have made us unhappy and corrupt, and that have even reached into our psychology and have warped our psychology, that Rousseauian idea is something that's very powerful throughout all these 19th century left-wing anarchists. Conservatives, on the other hand, someone going back to Edmund Burke in the 18th century, they agreed to some extent with Rousseau's analysis, but they disagreed with his conclusions. Conservatives like Edmund Burke said, our institutions of civil society, our families, our religion, our social hierarchies, that are not part of the state, but they're part of society itself, these things are in fact what save us. These are in fact the things that provide us with happiness and order and consolation in times of trouble. These things are in fact good. Rousseau said they were bad. Rousseau wanted to get rid of these institutions. Conservatives want to conserve those institutions and make them stronger. In the 20th century and then in the 21st century, the question is, does something like the federal government and does the state, in general as a concept, does it strengthen or weaken these institutions of civil society that are so dear to conservatives from, Edmund Burke to Robert Nisbet and others? Now, I want to add one further complication or interesting dimension to this. In the course of my studies in the 1990s and early 2000s, I came across this very interesting paradoxical phrase, Tory anarchist. So Tory, T-O-R-Y, and then anarchist. Tory, as you might know, is of course the word for conservative, denoting especially the Conservative Party in the UK. In the American context, it was the label that many of the American revolutionaries affixed to the loyalists who wanted America to remain connected with Great Britain. So the label Tory isn't very popular in America. The label conservative wasn't very popular either until around, in the aftermath of World War II. But Tory is a very, a word that denotes a very old-style conservatism, especially in Europe. And then anarchist, of course, seems to be exactly the opposite. How could you possibly combine the concept of Toryism and anarchism? Toryism is seen as being a defense of the established social order. Historically, it's been identified with, the party of the king and of the sort of lesser gentry. And, it is, certainly anti-revolutionary and very much opposed to the French Revolution. Whereas anarchism, would seem to be a revolutionary ideology. But there were a number of thinkers in the 19th century and the early 20th century who, without being in favor of these sort of grand new progressive schemes that arose in the early 20th century of using government power to kind of create more progress in society, there were a number of thinkers who had a kind of affection for the old Europe and for the manners and civilization that we have inherited from centuries and in fact millennia, going back to the Middle Ages and back to even the classical world. There were a number of thinkers, including literary men, including writers and authors and novelists, poets, artists, who liked this older ideal of civilization. In that sense, they were kind of temperamental Tories and did not like this kind of progressive government which had become the great fad of the early 20th century, and which would ultimately lead to the creation of welfare states, massive bureaucracies, things like the New Deal, etc. And so these individuals had an almost anarchist attitude when it came to this new burgeoning progressive big government, while at the same time having old-fashioned sort of Tory commitments to an older ideal of European civilization. And a number of figures who get labeled as Tory anarchists, it's a wide range, and it includes someone like Max Beerbohm, for example, the satirist. It includes, in the late 20th century, a brilliant satirist and newspaper columnist in Britain by the name of Auberon Waugh, who was the son of Evelyn Waugh, the wonderful Catholic novelist. And Evelyn Waugh, as well, also was occasionally labeled as a Tory anarchist. So you can see some of these interesting literary figures. Florence King, who was a writer for National Review in the late 20th century, she was occasionally called a Tory anarchist. If you go back farther, if you look at Jonathan Swift, writing in the early 18th century, Jonathan Swift, he too, wonderful satirist, very much a Tory, but was seen as being a kind of Tory anarchist. And if you read Gulliver's Travels, you can see a certain kind of anarchist, belief that among the best society, among the Winniehams, for example, in Gulliver's Travels, that you have, people who are so mature and self-governing and sort of conservative in their personal conduct that they require very little government to keep order among them. And that, I think, is sort of the primary Tory anarchist ideal. This idea that the more civilized people are, the more self-governing they are, the less need there is for any kind of bureaucracy to be ordering them around, and the less need there is for, the formal institutions of government. Now, to use the phrase Tory anarchist is more literary than political, and also it is, even as a to the extent that it's political, it's more philosophical than it really political. It has to do with political philosophy more than with concrete politics. And again, that political philosophical ideal is that among the people who are, truly committed to a civilized ideal, you have relatively little need among them for government. This is even perhaps alluded to in something like James Madison's Federalist Number 10, where Madison says there famously, if men were angels, you would not need government, but men are not angels, so of course you not only need to control, the people, but you also need to control government itself, and that's the great challenge that Americans had set for themselves with the United States Constitution and that James Madison's trying to explicate in Federalist Number 10. So even Madison, is alluding to this idea that the more civilized, the more, angelic is obviously a great ideal to aim for, but the more civilized people are, perhaps the less need there is for a meddlesome government to try to, get involved in their relations. There is, of course, the contrary idea, which is that as people are, sort of more disagreeable, less civilized, less polite, more rude, engaged in more conflicts with one another, more antisocial, then it's more and more important that you have a government to control them. And that is the classical argument, that government is necessary because otherwise people will behave savagely towards one another. A Tory anarchist partly agrees with that, but can also look at this situation and say, but if the people really are going to behave in such a savage way towards one another, if they really are that depraved, chances are their governors, the government itself, is also going to be depraved because the government is going to wield enormous power and it's going to be able to involve itself in all of these corrupt relationships and savage conflicts between people. And the government itself might get drawn into that savagery, and it's not necessarily going to be any less corrupt than the people as a whole. So the Tory anarchist ideal would say that actually it's very important, even to the extent that you're going to have limited government, the government takes its bearings in some degree from the people, not just the case that the people take their bearings from government. The young men of the new right in the 21st century tend to have a very strong faith that government can simply reshape people and make them virtuous, even if they are not virtuous to begin with. The Tory anarchist thinks there has to be a much more long-range approach, and that the battle is much more widely to be fought, because in fact you can't simply gain this kind of ring of power, supreme authority in federal government, and then simply use it to dictate that people are going to behave well, because, power doesn't actually extend that far. And the more you try to use power to, sort of force people to do what is not currently their habit, the more friction you create, and the more, in fact, that you may create a situation that is destabilized and that is then going to be prey to left-wing elements. And you see this oftentimes in the way in which left-wing radicals, revolutionaries, and authoritarian governments wind up fueling one another. The authoritarian government will claim we have to have more power because otherwise these revolutionaries are going to overthrow us, and we're going to have a French Revolution or a Russian Revolution, and it's going to be hell on earth. And similarly, the revolutionaries will say to normal people, hey, if you do not like having a secret police and having an authoritarian government constantly breathing down your neck, well, you've got to get rid of it, and the only way to get rid of it is to support revolutionaries like us who will do that. So you get a terrible dynamic which ultimately fuels the rise of left-wing revolutionary movements if you're relying too much on coercive power and authoritarianism. The Tory anarchists would say, well, you've really got to focus on, in fact, raising up the level of morality and civilization among the people as a whole. And that, of course, is something that is a very considerable component of conservative thinking in the 20th century as well. You find it with Robert Nisbet. You find it in varying degrees with Russell Kirk and Richard Weaver and others as well. Even people, who are traditionalist conservatives like Russell Kirk and Richard Weaver, they're not libertarians. And in fact, Kirk was very critical of libertarians. He called them chirping sectaries, for example. And yet Russell Kirk was also an ally of Murray Rothbard in supporting Pat Buchanan in the 1990s. And Russell Kirk was not, in fact, an advocate of big government. He hated the idea of, these big, bureaucratic institutions like the federal government, like the American, state university system, Russell Kirk liked the idea of a much more small-scale and neighborly kind of community, which he himself pursued in his hometown of Mecosta, Michigan. And if you visit the Russell Kirk Center in Mecosta, Michigan, you can kind of see that in practice. So Russell Kirk also did not like Leviathan giant government. Even though he was not an anarchist and not even a libertarian, he too rejected this idea that you're simply going to concentrate power and then somehow be able to use concentrated power for good purposes. The Tory anarchists would also point out that there is a world of difference between the old European political order, in which you had hereditary governments, in which you had, a balance of power in some respects between kings and the nobility, and even the commons to some degree. There is a world of difference between that and the modern scientific bureaucratic state. So the modern state is a relatively new invention, and it does not rely upon any of the old forms of authority, which was not always government authority, but also a kind of moral authority and social hierarchy that had been the case with government, before the French Revolution. Instead, the modern bureaucratic scientific state really rests on premises which may be fundamentally left-wing and progressive. And so the modern state may be antithetical even in its philosophical principles and foundations to the kind of community that conservatives want to have. And if that's the case, the idea of simply taking power in government and using that power for conservative ends is going to be futile, because the power itself, in fact, has a left-wing structure built into it in the form of its scientific and progressive, orientations and operations, and also in terms of this idea that you're going to use centralized power to accomplish your ends. But what does that do to civil society? Does it mean that civil society, in fact, is atrophied and is not able to exercise itself and exercise its own authority, because instead everything is concentrated centrally, and the big government is basically crowding out the social function of the family and the church and civil society? This, of course, was a major conservative criticism of the welfare state, right? The welfare state is going to say, we're going to take care of widows and orphans and people in their old age and the poor. This traditionally had been a major function of religion. This had been something that, in fact, made Christianity an extremely powerful institution in the Roman Empire long before Christianity was even tolerated in the Roman Empire. Because the Roman Empire didn't really take care of the poor, and certainly, didn't take care of widows and orphans to such a great degree. Christians were able to become a very important component of the Roman social order, even though the Romans didn't like it, because the Christians were supplying these social functions. Well, in the 20th century, big government took over those social functions, and now you have, Catholic Charities and any number of other religious organizations which want to have subsidies from the federal government in order to carry out their work. What's really happened is that the federal government has usurped the role of these old traditional religious organizations. It has usurped the social function of religion itself up to a certain point in taking care of the indigent. And that has led, of course, to a diminution of the place of religion in American public life, and it has only magnified the power of the federal government. So again, this idea that you could take over the federal government and then perhaps, give more money to religious organizations, that's been tried. In fact, George W. Bush tried it with his compassionate conservative initiatives. He wanted to give inner-city churches more government money to carry out their charitable work. But this winds up not really doing much good for the churches. It actually does much more in terms of giving the federal government more power and, crowding out, the actual place of religion and of civil society in being able to help people take care of themselves and their own communities and their own families. This is why the Catholic Church, by the way, has a social philosophy called subsidiarity. And subsidiarity says, you should leave to the most local authorities possible, including the family, whatever is within their own power to accomplish. So there are things that these different levels of society must do that are good, including the family, including local neighborhoods and communities. To the extent that those local levels are able to accomplish the good on their own, they should be left to do it on their own. You should not have higher authorities intervening simply to meddle in what the lower authorities are completely competent to take care of. It's the place of higher authorities, rather, to intervene when there are things that these lower authorities and more local authorities cannot take care of for themselves. And that, I think, is also the correct lesson for conservatives to take about American federalism. That American federalism doesn't mean that we have to be constantly worried about the balance between states' rights and the federal government. There is a role for the federal government, and in fact, there's a reason why we created a federal government in the first place with the United States Constitution in the last decade of the 18th century. And that is, that you do need to have a federal government for, ends of national security, for, a number of other functions, including, of course, going back to the origins of the American federal government, things like tariffs and trade policy were very much part of the activity of America's statesmen at the time of the framing of the Constitution. So paleoconservative Hamiltonians, who obviously look all the way back to Alexander Hamilton himself, they're not wrong to say that, in fact, you do need a degree of nationalism. What needs to be emphasized, however, is that national conservatism should exist in the service of local community. It should exist in the service of protecting those institutions of civil society that are, highlighted by the Catholic doctrine of subsidiarity, and that are also part of our American inheritance, in the concept of federalism, that we want to protect local authorities. But one way you protect local authorities from, for example, waves of massive immigration, which might completely disrupt local ties and might completely overwhelm local institutions that are not, equipped to deal with a massive influx of population. One way to prevent that is to have the federal government make sure that we have strong borders and a immigration policy that is well enforced. Likewise, to prevent localities from being wiped out by unfair competition from Chinese businesses, and in fact, this collaboration between the government of China and Chinese corporations, is to make sure that we have a national trade policy that is providing a degree of shield and shelter for our local communities. And similarly, when it comes to foreign policy, we should think not in terms of trying to transform the entire planet into a system like our own of liberalism and democracy. On the contrary, we should be using our foreign policy to make sure that we are keeping America safe, so that we can have this perfection of our community life at the local level. America, has a foreign policy that should be serving the national interest, which in turn is serving the local interest, rather than have, all the local interests, I should say, and the common good, rather than have a policy which is trying to be globalist and ideological, and in fact revolutionary, because that's what exporting democracy abroad amounts to. It's a kind of, it's the vision of the French Revolution in terms of trying to export itself, to all of its neighbors. So I hope these remarks help to clarify why my Twitter handle is Tory anarchist. It's not that that is a label for a political program. It's not even saying necessarily that anarchy in the real world is a good idea. Rather, what it's saying is that there are certain philosophical ideas or ideals that both the term Tory and the term anarchist are pointing to in terms of the importance of subsidiarity and federalism and the importance of locality. And it's simply, a kind of funny, paradoxical term that will then, I think, if people look into it, lead them to discover brilliant satirists like Jonathan Swift and indeed Evelyn Waugh and Auberon Waugh, and that will also lead them to look at some of the very interesting figures on the American right who were prominent before World War II, figures like H.L. Mencken and Albert J. Nock. Nock himself, labeled himself as an anarchist. H.L. Mencken may not have used that phrase, but he was very critical of this idea of progressive scientific government. And that criticism of, this complex on the left, which is a compound, a hybrid of massive federal government power, state power on the one hand, together with a corrupted and politically correct or woke form of capitalism, together with, higher education and various forms of, sort of left-wing social organization. That complex, which state power and especially the deep state in the federal government is a key component, that complex is really the thing that conservatives need to be opposing, because that is the left using all of the different instruments of power, including government coercive power, including market power, including the power of educational prestige, including the power of propaganda and communications through the media. The left is using all of those tools and instruments to promote its radical revolutionary transformation of American virtues and values, the destruction of the virtues and the implementation of a new set of anti-Christian and anti-traditionalist values and views instead. That is the opponent that conservatives must be opposed to. And you can find a broad coalition on the right, including, old paleo-libertarian types, heirs to Murray Rothbard to some degree. Certainly paleo-conservatives have been proved to be correct in a great many points, including on immigration and trade and foreign policy. But you can find a wide swath of conservatives of all descriptions who recognize what this, complex on the left is, and that it is the opponent that must be, fought against. And then, there are, of course, tensions in such a broad coalition, sometimes between, Rothbardian anarcho-capitalists and paleo-conservatives, sometimes between members of the new right who want to have a greater role for federal government and who in fact would argue that you've had so much destruction of America's local communities already and so much weakening of civil society that the only way to strengthen these things anew in the 21st century is, in fact, to have the federal government or have more centralized power come in and rescue and rebuild these local institutions that have been destroyed. So an argument, even following the ideal of subsidiarity that can be made for a stronger federal government is to say, actually, you need to have conservatives take control of it because, it's not enough simply to defend the more local sources of authority and community. You have to actually rebuild those older local sources of community and authority because they've been so badly damaged and destroyed by all the left-wing, sort of policies and propaganda of the last 80 plus years in America. And in fact, maybe even going back farther. So you will continue to have these philosophical debates on the American right, and some of these philosophical debates will have policy implications. But these are debates that are worth having that actually make conservatives intellectually stronger and morally stronger as well. And we should understand where these different sides in these debates are coming from and, sort of what view of society and the relationship between society and politics, in fact, and economics as well, are involved in these different new right, libertarian, anarcho-capitalist, paleo-conservative ideas. It is a fascinating inheritance for the American right of the 21st century, something that is to be explored with delight, but not without a certain critical eye. And that, conservatives have to be practical. We're not, simply trying to create a Platonic republic here on Earth. We are, in fact, trying to deal with the flawed humanity as it is, to create a social order that is as good as we can possibly have within the constraints of human nature and original sin. You can always find out more about these ideas by going to Modern Age at modernagejournal.com, subscribe to the print magazine, and you can follow me online on social media, including on Twitter, or X as it's now called, with the handle @ToryAnarchist.